Hello, everybody, and welcome to another day of AP World History Modern live stream. It's a Monday, the first day of the week, and this is technically our last week together for AP Live History, for AP World History Live. But remember, next week, even though we're not going to have the normal lessons and style of lessons that we've had since the end of March, we are going to come together every day at 5 o'clock, and we're going to work on specific AP practice. This is our last week for AP World History Live. Next week, we're calling AP Prep Week. On Monday and Wednesday, we're going to do our best to simulate what it'll be like to take the AP World History test in the year 2020. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to give you guys examples of acceptable answers to the DBQ that we gave you on Monday and or Wednesday. And of course, Friday, we're going to come together, Mr. Logereau and I, and work together for tips and tricks to help you be successful in the AP World History test. On Friday, Mr. Logereau said you could tell the difference between us because he's the history nerd and I'm the cool teacher. But I assure you, my students have already challenged that assertion that Mr. Logereau made to let me know that I am, in fact, not cool. So he's the major history nerd and I'm just the regular nerd. So that's me, Mr. Smith, and I teach at MacArthur High School in Irving, which is a part of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Let's start off by going over the homework assignment Mr. Logereau gave us on Friday. As Mr. Logereau pointed out, this is an SAQ format of a question, which is not the format of the test you're going to take on May 21st at 1 o'clock Central Time. If it's not 5 o'clock where you are, then you're not taking the test at 1 o'clock. So if you're not sure about time zones, talk to your AP history teacher. Even though you're not going to do an SAQ, you are going to do these same skills. You are going to have to read a document and understand the message and how it relates to the prompt. And you're definitely going to have to provide outside evidence. So this first question says, describe one argument that the author makes about revolutions in the first paragraph. Excuse me. Here's some possible responses. The author argues that revolutions have been rare but momentous occasions in world history. The author, I'm not going to try to say that last name, you guys. You already know how it is with me in pronunciation. So the author argues that revolutions have impacts beyond national borders because people in other countries often seek to copy revolutions, or that revolutions influence people from other countries who want to imitate them. Another possible answer is that the author claims that revolutions are significant because people who oppose revolutions in one country still feel compelled to react to the potential threats that revolutions in other countries may pose. Let's go on to the next two questions where you'll have more opportunity to cross-reference skills with the DBQ. The first question asks you to provide one piece of evidence from the period 1750 that would support the author's argument about revolution and class. Now remember, this is called evidence beyond the document on the AP test or on the DBQ. And you can do this 2 times in your essay. If you provide 2 separate pieces of evidence and they can support any claim that you make throughout your essay, then you'll get 2 out of the 10 points. So this is a really important skill because that's going to help you be successful on your DBQ. So here's 2 answers. You could support the author's argument by using the French Revolution, because the French Revolution was led by members of the lower and middle class against the nobility. The same is true of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was a revolution of slaves against the revolution against French rule and the elite class in Haiti. So both of those are examples of lower classes rebelling against upper classes. The third question asks you to provide outside evidence that would challenge the author's argument in the passage. This will help you with a third, and what I would say is the absolute most challenging part of the DBQ. I think the most challenging point to earn on the DBQ is point number 10, what we call the complexity point. Complexity is extraordinarily hard to earn because unlike outside evidence, complexity cannot be earned in just one or two sentences, but complexity must be demonstrated throughout your essay. It must come in your claims, it must come in your response to your claims and your support of your claims. And one way to earn the complexity point is to produce nuance in your argument and to show how, while your argument is supported by evidence, there also is historical evidence that might challenge or modify your argument. And so this question here is helping you to develop the skill of developing a complicated or nuanced argument and supporting that nuance, supporting those details with evidence. So here's some potential responses. The American Revolution would challenge the author's argument because it was led by members of the elite class. The revolutions in Latin America challenged the argument because Creoles and did not have the same social structure or political power as the Peninsulares. They were elites with tremendous influence. So the Creoles who led the Latin American influence and the leaders of the American Revolution were both members of elite classes, thereby challenging the argument of the author here. All right, let's get into today's lesson. I'm going to show you 5 pictures. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to look at each picture. And as you look at each picture, I want you to think about what you see. What characteristics or details do you notice in each picture? I might pause for a moment and point out a couple of things as we go along, but basically I'm going to give you 15 seconds. That would be, minutes would be way too much time. 15 seconds with each picture. And I want you to think and guess the theme that we're looking at today. So let's take a moment and look. Okay, hopefully as you were looking at these pictures, you followed the theme of industrialization or the industrial period of world history. A couple of things that I want to point out to you that I hope you notice. One, I want to point out that these are factories, and these are factories where coal is being burned in order to produce more energy. We'll talk about that process a little bit later, but I want to point out that is a group of factories in one location, and that they've grouped together so in essentially a factory sector or an area of the town that is made up of mostly factories. Also, we're not going to talk about this today, but notice how bad this kind of smoke must be for the environment. Here you see the same effect from the factories, only you see it on a ship. And you also see much smaller ships almost looking in amazement at this steamship, mostly because they have to use human muscle and human energy to operate their ships, or the environment by depending on the wind, while this ship actually has the ability to turn on and off its energy source. Here you see many women doing what seems to be the same job over and over and over again. And it's important to notice that the workers here, the ones sitting at the stools, are women. And the ones who are standing over them, observing or supervising, those are the men. Here you notice children. Again, the same idea, the machines with the same function or task over and over and over again, but here 2 children working or preparing to work at these machines. Notice that these children working aren't necessarily dressed in elite clothing. One of them doesn't even have shoes. Finally, we see an image of the same idea of women working, having the same function or task, but it's important to note that these are not Western-looking people as we've seen in the other images. Instead, these are Japanese women. All right, let's take a moment and dig into our lesson for today. I want to give you 4 claims that we're going to seek to prove as we work throughout our lesson today. So as we go throughout the video, these are 4 specific claims that we're looking to validate with evidence and further understand. Number 1, the Industrial Revolution started in Britain because of a unique set of circumstances. Number 2, the Industrial Revolution spread from Britain to the rest of Europe and the United States. Later, it spread to places like Japan and Russia. As it spread, the global share of manufacturing shifted. Excuse me. The Industrial Revolution depends on new technologies, especially the steam engine, which uses coal, a new source of energy. And number 4, governments used a variety of strategies from business-friendly policies and little regulation all the way to direct control in order to facilitate the industrial process. So let's dig into these ideas and seek to prove these claims with more evidence. Let's start with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and how and why it began, particularly in Britain. So let's take a moment and let's look at these factors that are actually the exact wording and phrase that come from the College Board description of the World History curriculum. These exact wording and phrasing include proximity to waterways and access to rivers and canals, geographical distribution of coal, iron, and timber, urbanization, improved agricultural productivity, legal protection of private property, access to foreign resources, and accumulation of capital. But what does all of this mean, and how does it make the Industrial Revolution possible? So let's take a few minutes and start by looking at this map. On this map, you see the importance of coal fields and their relative significance or their relative closeness to industrial centers. And you can see how where it started, there's lots and lots of coal. And these significant amounts of coal made it possible for these multiple industrial centers to grow in Britain. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, as industrial centers came later, they're further away from the coal deposits. And that's an important reality because the geographic features of coal and iron and timber made it possible for the Industrial Revolution to take place. It's also important that in Britain, it's an island and it's covered with canals and rivers. This is important for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because it makes transportation much cheaper and more possible. And it's important for transportation to be cheap and effective, and rivers make that possible far more than moving coal or goods over land. But another reality is that early factories didn't use coal at all. As a matter of fact, before the development of coal and coal-based energy, coal as an energy source, factories often used water. They had water wheels that would keep a wheel moving, which would produce the energy needed in the movement for a factory or a machine. And so oftentimes factories and factory sectors were built near waterways, not just for the transportation, but because of the early dependence on moving water for that to work. So it's important to notice that many of these ideas work together and none of them is independent from the other. They mix together to help develop an important movement or process in world history. Take, for example, urbanization. Urbanization is the process of people moving into and densely populating cities, and those cities growing. But urbanization can't be possible without some of these other things that are listed here. For example, improved agricultural productivity. The massive amounts of improved agricultural productivity that took place in the early 1700s as a result of new technology, as a result of crops and goods from the Columbian Exchange, as a result of new legal practices, like down here, it says access to private property. All of those things helped increase agricultural productivity. And as we've mentioned before, and might even mention again, more food always means more people. And in the case of industrialization and preparation for industrialization, more people meant more workers, more people in the labor force. That was an important reality, and it was a necessary factor for the progression of the process of the Industrial Revolution. It's also important to note here the enclosure movement of Europe, oh my gosh, the enclosure movement of Britain, which was actually just building fences and forcing people not to use and grow on other people's lands. What this actually did was it destroyed the livelihood of many small farmers and forced them out of, you just heard my Missouri accent there. That was scary. Sounded like my mom. And forced them out of the small farming industry and into cities, thereby helping to improve or increase urbanization. Okay, couple of other things here. A stable political government that made it possible for businesses and entrepreneurial or starting adventurous businesses to thrive and grow. And the idea of capitalism, the growth of the economic system of capitalism that focused on the existence of capital and using and risking capital in order to grow a business and be more successful. This encouraged competition, which encouraged innovative ideas, which helped lead to the development of many of the new technologies we'll talk about later. The one last thing was the fact that throughout the period 1450 to 1750, European states like Great Britain had been spreading their empire through North America and the Indian Ocean. And in doing so, they had developed new resources and they had access to many raw materials that were developed throughout the world. And those raw materials were brought back to Britain, and that's what they were able to use to manufacture and produce at extraordinarily high levels. It's also important to remember that the factory system that we looked at when we looked at a picture where there were many sectors or factories and how people seemed to be doing the same repetitive task over and over again led to a high degree of specialization of labor. Specialization of labor means different people in society are doing different jobs. And what it means is that people had very, very specific ideas about what it was that their job was supposed to be. Oftentimes, many jobs in the industrialization were non-skilled jobs, which were jobs that people were able to do with very little education or training. After the industrialization had burgeoned in Britain, it spread very quickly to other parts of Europe, spread to places like Belgium, and despite political instability, spread to what we today call Germany, and eventually it even spread to France, despite the political instability there as a result of the French Revolution, which Mr. Laugereau spoke with you guys about on Friday. It also spread to the United States, where industrialization thrived as a result of many urban centers and an extraordinary population, which was able to produce human capital or a massive workforce. Eventually, industrialization spread to Russia. But in Russia, as a matter of mere geography and its extraordinary size, but also as a result of its absolute rule, its system of agricultural production that relied on nobles and serfs, industrialization spread through Russia very slowly. The government focused primarily on building railroads and getting exports out of Russia. So despite the fact that over the course of the second half of the 1800s, Russia's government was directing an industrial process, by 1900, Russia was still a majority agrarian society, meaning the primary function of its economy was agricultural and not industrial. It's not until 1917 in the Russian Revolution when a new government takes over and begins to actually transition the economy more thoroughly away from agricultural production toward industrialization. But we're not going to talk much about what happened after 1900 because, well, your AP World History DBQ is only able to be between 1200 and 1900. But if you're interested in learning more about Russia after 1900, please go back and look at the Unit 8 videos. All right, let's take about 2 minutes here and read this document. As you're reading this document, there's two questions at the bottom for you to think of. What was the role of the government in the process of Russian industrialization? And can you analyze the source? Remember, analyzing the source is a two-step process. You use historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view, and you figure out how that affects the understanding of the document or your answer to the question. I'll give you a minute. I'll give you 2 minutes and then we'll discuss. All right, let's take a second and look at the document. So, what was the role of the government in the process of Russian industrialization? Well, the author here, Sergei Witt, spends a lot of time talking about how to continue the process of industrialization. And then at the end of the document, he makes his point, which is that he has a goal that he would like the audience to pursue. And that goal is if we carry out our commercial and industrial system begun in the reign of Alexander III consistently to the end, then we will come of age economically. See, when he says we, you look at the top and you can see that Sergei Witt is a member of the government speaking to the leader of the government. So for Sergei Witt, we means the government. What was the role of the government in the process of Russian industrialization? The process of Russian industrialization was directly sponsored and controlled by the government. The government made direct policies and the government took direct action. This is very different from in Britain or the United States, where, say, the government would give business-friendly policies. For example, the United States would give land grants to railroad companies or patent protection or protection of private property. But they didn't have any government-directed action. In Russia, the state directly controlled it. Now, the second question is, can you analyze the source? And when I analyze this source, I directly think about the fact, two things: purpose or audience and point of view. So I guess that's three things. So again, it's important to remember that the four ideas of historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view are together a toolbox for you to use. And if you need multiple tools to get the job done, then you should use multiple tools. But if you only need one tool to get the job done, then you can only use one tool. You use the tools you need to get that job done. So here I think about the fact that this is a government member of the government who has a goal, and he's trying to persuade the leader, the head of the government. And so because his goal is to persuade the head of the government to continue doing the government system of industrialization, it affects both his description of the potential flaws of not industrializing. For example, the problems of being behind European trade. And also possibly he overemphasizes the benefits of things like Asian trading with Asia. And especially, he potentially overemphasizes in the very last sentence, the results of continuing with the system, the government-run system. He says, then her prosperity, her trade, and finance will be based on two reliable pillars, and the relations between them profitable to both. He may be over-exaggerating the results of continuing such a system. Let's talk about how industrialization spread to Japan. Industrialization spread to Japan as a direct result of actions taken on behalf of the United States of America. See, the United States of America was interested in trading with Japan, but in the early 1800s, Japan was completely isolated from the rest of the world. They were so isolated, in fact, that if European sailors shipwrecked and landed in Japan, they could be arrested and potentially even executed by the Japanese government. The United States of America sent Admiral Matthew Perry to Japan, and Matthew Perry demanded to meet with Japanese government leaders and demanded that the Japanese government leaders open up Japan to trade. He wanted what was called the open door policy. See, Matthew Perry was a little bit savage in his introduction to the Japanese leaders. He brought them gifts such as a white flag folded and prepared. So that way, if the Japanese shogun or the Japanese military leader denied Matthew Perry's request for an open door policy, the Japanese would have a flag to use to surrender when America decided to force their hand. I believe in teenage talk, that makes Matthew Perry a bit savage. So the thing is, Matthew Perry could back up his threats because he had more firepower on his ships than they had on the Japanese coast. And so the Japanese shogun or military leader acquiesced and signed what was known as unequal treaties in order to establish open door policy with the United States of America. By the way, here you're looking at an image that shows you quite a point of view. This ship that looks as if it's a monster is what the Japanese called black ships and represents Matthew Perry's ship that was brought to Japan in order to demand open door policy. After this incident where the Japanese signed the unequal treaties, many members of Japanese society were upset, and this initiated what was called the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration was the process of literally restoring or giving back power to the Meiji emperor. Meiji was the family name of the emperor. In doing so, in restoring the power to the emperor, they took it away from the military the shogun. And they reorganized in many aspects after Western Britain and United States of America. So as a part of the Meiji Restoration came a 25-year thorough and complete industrial process. All right. So Japan took 25 years to have a successful industrial process. Take a moment and look at this document here. I want you to read this document and I want you to answer the questions at the bottom. What was the role of the government in the process of Japanese industrialization? And can you analyze the source? I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, let's take a couple seconds and look at this document. So a few things here. Over and over and over again, this author is telling us that the government actually overtook these specific efforts in the industrial process, the education, the establishment of various factories, direct supervision, and that the actual departments of the government actually overtook manufacturing in specific industries and sectors. Finally, the government begins the process of machinery, of using capital, which is another word for money that can be put into business, and for even the construction of the railway. So just like in Russia, the Japanese industrialization was a state-directed and managed process. However, one important difference between Japan and Russia is the degree of success. While both of them were directly while both of them were directly managed by the state, only one of them was able to successfully transition to a growing, thriving industrial economy. That was Japan. If I was going to analyze this source, I would point out the fact that this article is written by a former leader of Japan, but more importantly, I would point out that it was published in the United States magazine. Clearly, this article is used in order to prove to the United States that they made a mistake when they underestimated Japan and demanded the signing of the unequal treaties back in 1853. Back in the 1850s, I'm not 100% sure about 53 now that I say it. So because the author might be trying to prove a point to the Americans who had previously underestimated, they may be over-exaggerating the success of their own industries and the success of their government with the production of the industrial capacity there. All right. Real quickly, it's important to note that as industrialization grew in places like the United States and Europe, and even in Japan, places that formerly had lots of manufacturing lost or decreased in their global share of manufacturing. Shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia decreased. Same with iron in India. As a matter of fact, a lot of these have to do also with their relationship with Britain. Many of the places in the Middle East and Asia and well, in the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia, where there was a major decrease in their share of manufacturing, that decrease took place because they had new relationships with the Europeans, and they, in many places, they were indirectly or directly colonized, and therefore their raw materials were being transported to Europe, where they were being manufactured there as a result of European industrialization. Let's talk briefly about some of the important technologies of the Industrial Revolution. We've already hinted at this by discussing the fact that that maybe even the most important factor of the Industrial Revolution is that it is a new source of energy. Instead of human muscle or animal muscle, or even the ability of the wind to move things, coal was developed as a new source of energy. Coal is an example of what we call a fossil fuel. There's a whole bunch of it in the ground. And as we looked before, a lot of it was in Europe. So coal is used in order to create steam, and steam is used in order to make different functions of something move, and that movement can create something like an engine. As a matter of fact, the engine is maybe the most important part of, or actual invention of, the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine, which was powered by coal, was put into lots of things, put into factories to help make machines move, put onto ships in order to help make ships move, put onto carriages in order to make trains and make cars move, and trains move, excuse me. This was an important reality. The steam engine was maybe one of the most important parts of the Industrial Revolution. Another important invention in the Industrial Revolution was iron. In the late part of the 18th, oh my gosh, in the late part of the 19th century, which is also the 1800s after 1850, and the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, especially in United States, Britain, and Germany, there's a period of time known as the Second Industrial Revolution, where a new wave of inventions helped create new opportunities for people. Steel, oil, electricity, and communication technologies such as the telegraph and telephone all were examples of new technologies that that were part of the Second Industrial Revolution. Lastly, in other parts of the world, there were much less successful efforts at industrialization, and varying degrees that the government played a role in the industrial process. One of the most important examples is the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was one of the three major gunpowder empires that were Islamic-run states in the period 1450 to 1750. And when the Ottoman Empire was growing, it was known as the strong sword of Islam. But by the 1800s, especially after 1850, the Ottoman Empire was better known by its new nickname, the Sick Man of Europe. It's an extraordinary change for such an empire. Some of the problems that led to this change included ethnic nationalism, as various groups of people who were different from the Ottoman Turkic Muslims who were in control sought to find ways to get independence and create states that were homogenous or the same type. Other problems included corruption among leaders. One problem for the Ottoman Empire came in Egypt, and a rising nationalist leader named Muhammad Ali. In Egypt, leader Muhammad Ali became essentially the governor of Egypt and was ordained or supported by the Sultan, but primarily because the Sultan had no choice because of the power of the army that Muhammad Ali had developed. He began to reform Egypt, and based off of European models, particularly models from the state of France. One important change that he made included taxing and an extraordinary overtaxing of people, especially small farmers and peasants across the state. So much so that they ended up having to forfeit their own property over to the government, which led to massive amounts of state-run cotton and agricultural production. and the process of state-run textile industrialization, where the government actually built factories in order to produce more textiles in Egypt, which was ultimately a part of the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's take a minute and let's go back and look at the claims we made at the beginning of the lesson. I'm going to pause for 2 minutes and I'm going to let you look over your notes. I want you to try to come up with examples or evidence that support each of these claims. So I'll give you 2 minutes, look at each claim, and try to come up with 1 or 2 pieces of evidence from our discussion today that support each claim. Okay, let's come up with some evidence here. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain because of a unique set of circumstances. We talked about convenient geographies such as coal fields and iron and timber. We also talked about rivers and canals and access to waterways. We talked about demographic changes such as increased population and the process of urbanization. We talked about political and economic opportunities such as the accumulation of capital, and the ability to make money so that you could spend it into a business and take a risk with some sort of innovation or new business idea. We also talked about the protection of private property and patent laws that helped to protect people's inventions from getting stolen. The Industrial Revolution spread from Britain to the rest of Europe and the United States. Later, it spread to places like Japan and Russia. As it spread, the global share of manufacturing shifted. We talked about how Europe and US followed the British model, and where they had government made opportunities without directly controlling the industrial process. We talked about how Russia was slow and late to industrial, and that by the end of 1900, their industrial process was not complete. It continued to be a majority agrarian society. We talked about how the Japanese state-run rapid industrialization was successful and was a response to the American aggression in Japan. We also talked about the shift in manufacturing as iron in India decreased, as textiles in India and Egypt decreased, and other examples as well. The Industrial Revolution depends on new technologies, especially the steam engine, which uses coal, a new source of energy. We talked about the steam engine being placed on ships and trains in order to increase transportation, both of goods, raw materials, which was able to increase more manufacturing, of manufactured goods, which was able to increase trade, and of people, which helped to increase migration. We also talked about the technologies of the Second Industrial Revolution. Finally, governments used a variety of strategies from business-friendly policies and little regulation all the way to direct control in order to facilitate the industrial process. We talked about the business-friendly policies and little regulation of Europe and the US. We talked about direct control in Russia and Japan. And we talked about the attempts of the Ottoman Empire to develop the industrial process. Okay. If you look down in the description of the video below, you'll see a link which will take you to a Google Drive. And in that Google Drive, there's a document titled 5.3 through 5.6 Homework Documents. Tonight, there's one prompt and two documents. So what I want you to do is I want you to write a paragraph. Start your paragraph with a topic sentence that makes a clear claim. Use both documents to support your claim. Attempt to analyze the source of at least one of the two documents and add evidence from outside your brain. Mr. Laugereau will go over an exemplar paragraph with you tomorrow. Before we go, I want to let you guys know you probably got an email, but I want to remind you that the College Board has recently partnered with a website, an organization called quill.org. Quill.org is an online tool to help you improve your writing skills. So if you go to quill.org/AP, you can create a free account that will help you to build your writing skills and help you with grammar and syntax. Now, while this is an extraordinary opportunity for you, I also want to remind you that grammar and syntax are not on your AP World History rubric. And when you take your AP World History test, you need to focus on the 10 points that are on the rubric, because your readers, I know I've been one of them for several years, know that they're reading a rough draft. However, this is an extraordinary opportunity and one I encourage you all to take advantage of. Thank you so much for watching with us today. Come back tomorrow at 5 o'clock, where Mr. Laugereau is going to talk to you about the social and economic realities of the Industrial Revolution. Thanks, guys.